Welcome to a quantum guide for researchers on unmasking misdirection in the research landscape. Let's begin with the premise, because unlike most disciplines, we're not going to pretend the foundation is solid until proven otherwise. In research, the starting point is rarely discovery, it's context. You inherit citations, methods, theories, narratives. You enter a world already framed by publishers, institutions, funding agencies, and the reputational economies that determine who gets cited and who gets buried. Most researchers accept that frame, assuming its legitimacy. But this guide begins with a different assumption, that misdirection is not rare or accidental in the academic landscape. It is routine, systemic, often intentional, and it operates not through falsification, but through emphasis, omission, framing, and sequencing, methods of control far more sophisticated than outright deception. We'll look at misdirection through four primary dimensions: physical, psychological, narrative, and temporal. And in each, we'll borrow from quantum theory, not for metaphorical flair, but for structural insight into how attention, belief, and interpretation are engineered. Physical misdirection is the control of focus and the illusion of consensus. In quantum mechanics, observing a particle collapses its wave function. The system had many possible states, but once you look, you get only one. In research, this collapse happens through emphasis. Certain studies get cited, certain names get remembered, certain phrases, seminal paper, groundbreaking theory, get attached like badges of authority. And once they're in rotation, they're everywhere. Review papers repeat them, textbooks canonize them, researchers building new work on old scaffolding take them for granted. But here's the trick. The emphasis was never neutral, it was chosen. It was often strategic, highlighting studies that fit an institutional agenda, a funding direction, or a disciplinary orthodoxy. And what gets left out? Contradictions, counterexamples, studies published in the wrong journals by the wrong people in the wrong tone. This is physical misdirection in research collapse of attention onto a chosen focal point. The method is to flood the field with repetition until the illusion of consensus becomes indistinguishable from truth. The real researcher widens the frame. You look not just at what's cited, but what's strategically ignored. You don't assume that prominence equals rigor. You ask, what had to be excluded for this to become central? And then you go there. Psychological misdirection refers to the creation of an architecture of assumptions. Psychological misdirection doesn't operate in the literature, it operates in you, but not in the self-help sense of unconscious bias. We're talking about the engineered shaping of belief embedded in training, in discipline formation, in methodological dogma, passed off as neutral best practice. You're trained to recognize certain forms of argument as rigorous, others as speculative. You're told which models are tested, which theories are obsolete, which thinkers are fringe. But who told you that? Whose authority coded that into your curriculum, your peer review structure, your publishing incentives? This isn't introspection, it's reverse engineering the belief architecture of your field. Psychological misdirection collapses interpretive possibility before you even start. You don't think you're choosing a framework, you think you're just being scientific. But that's the collapse. The manufactured feeling of inevitability, like a wave function collapsing into the only state you were trained to see. So what's the strategy? You hold open the interpretive field. You sustain cognitive superposition, multiple interpretations, multiple frameworks, even ones your mentors warned you against. You ask, what am I trained to see as illegitimate? And who benefits from that exclusion? That's your lead. Narrative misdirection uses the clean story as concealment. This one's the most seductive, because it's not just misdirection, it's mythology. Most disciplines tell the story of their own progress as a steady climb, problems solved, questions refined, tools sharpened, theories replaced by better ones, each era improving on the last. And like any good illusion, it's built on selective framing. Timelines are compressed, disputes are flattened, schools of thought are collapsed into lone representatives, entire intellectual bloodbaths are summarized in 2 footnotes and a transition sentence. But those edits aren't academic housekeeping, they're narrative control, and the purpose is coherence. The smoother the story, the less you question it. The more inevitable it feels, the less you look for what's been cut. Narrative misdirection entangles evidence and omission to create the illusion of progress. It's not a lie. It's an engineering of attention to frame not just what happened, but what it meant, and to exclude all other meanings from memory. So how do you break it? You become an archivist of absence. You trace the exclusions, the theories that were once real contenders but disappeared without a rebuttal. You go into the margins, not to give voice to the forgotten, but to recover the contested field of reality before it was simplified. Temporal misdirection sees history rewritten by the present. In quantum theory, delayed choice experiments show that present decisions can affect how we understand past events. In research, temporal misdirection plays a similar game. Later interpretations overwrite earlier meanings. Revisions, retractions, and reinterpretations are retroactively cast as corrections to obvious errors, when in reality, they often re-narrate power struggles as intellectual evolution. You'll see it in phrases like, "At the time this was a breakthrough, but now we understand." That now flattens everything that didn't survive. It implies resolution. It masks unresolved tension behind the appearance of closure. Temporal misdirection also uses sequencing to manipulate authority. What was published first appears more original. What came after is labeled derivative, even if the timeline was manipulated by access, funding, or editorial delay. So your job is to reconstruct the timeline not just of publication, but of reception and suppression. Who was dismissed early on only to be vindicated later? Whose work was buried during its time, only to be repackaged by someone with more institutional clout? That's your real historical method. You've been trained to trust the system, to believe that the peer review process filters out noise, that consensus reflects convergence on truth, that the most cited voices earned their place. This guide says, assume the opposite. Assume that misdirection is baked into the structure, that what you inherit is not a neutral map of intellectual terrain, but a designed path, one that takes you somewhere very specific and keeps you from wandering too far off course. The quantum perspective isn't about metaphor, it's about systems of control. Observation collapses possibility, emphasis restricts attention, framing distorts causality, and sequencing rewrites history. To resist misdirection, you don't just read harder, you read against the structure, you widen the aperture, you restore contested realities. You keep interpretation open, not because you're indecisive, but because you know the collapse is coming, and you intend to control when, where, and how it happens. That's the task. Interrogate the frame, resist the collapse, and build research that sees the whole field, not just what was made visible.